2024 really represented a significant change and kind of a weird feeling when it came to the Seattle Seahawks because for the first time since 2009, someone other than Pete Carroll would be this team's head coach. That's a decade and a half as a head coach of one team. That is rare, right? You just don't see that a lot. Sure, you have guys like John Harbaugh and Mike Tomlin that have been with their teams for a very long period of time, but they are the exception to the rule. So many NFL head coaches are fired in 3 to 4 years, so few of them make it to 10 years or more, but to get to like 15 seasons, that's nuts. So, this is literally like, think about it this way. Somebody that was maybe 5 years old in 2010 that may have started to become a Seahawks fan. By the time Pete Carroll is gone, they are college students now. Might even have kids of their own, right? It's just insane to think about. So I was going to be curious to see after the first time in a long time of having a new head coach in the fold, like what was this team going to do under Mike McDonald? And they got off to a promising start, right? They started off 3-0. And when you're thinking about, hey, got a new leader, got a new direction, got a new vision for this team, hard to know what it's going to look like. The early returns were promising, but what I think you really saw here with the Seahawks in 2024 was a season of kind of polar opposites. They start off 3-0, and then they lose their next three. So all of that early positive momentum, you just immediately wiped out. 3-0 is great. 3-3 is mid. You'd rather be great than mid. And I understand you have stretches where you might play better than others, play worse than others, but again, this was kind of a yo-yo season for them. They start off 3-0, then they lose their next three, win, then lose their next two, then win 4 in a row, then they lose 2, then they win 2. And they get to this spot where they end up winning double-digit games and technically win as many games as the Rams in the NFC West, but lose the division due to tiebreakers, and as a consequence, don't make the playoffs. That sucks, right? Double-digit win team and you miss the playoffs. Sometimes them's the breaks. And you want to look at like why that happened, from a like macro level view in terms of the team as a whole. There's a couple of things, right? You went 1-3 against the NFC North. Your one win was against the Bears, and that came late in the year, and it was 6-3. Yikes! Like double yikes, yoinks, right? But you lose to the Lions and the Packers and the Vikings. If you win one of those games, just one of those games, you win the NFC West and you get a home playoff game, and maybe even get a home playoff win, right? And then you could take a look at that and you say, the worst loss of the year was the Week 5 loss to the Giants. That was brutal. Just bad. The Giants tied for worst record in the league. They've got the third overall pick. Like if you look back at a season, there are certain pivotal games and moments, even if they happened earlier in the year, where you say, if this goes differently, then it means this. Don't lose to the Giants in Week 5, and if everything else plays out as it did, you're 11-6, you win the division, you make the playoffs, home playoff game, and possibly could beat the Vikings, right, in the wild card round. So it's just a good example in the NFL of teams have got to be on point at all times, and you cannot take opponents lightly. And in particular, you have to beat the bad teams, because when you don't beat the bad teams, it has a way of jumping up and biting you square in the ass. It's exactly what happened to the Seahawks here. Looking back at the season overall, though, Geno Smith had another solid year, threw for over 400 yards, but he did also have 15 interceptions, so a bit of a thing of productive in the passing game, but at times a little reckless, a little careless. Bigger surprise here, especially knowing how their identity was on offense under Pete Carroll so many years, where they emphasized the power running game almost to a fault. They were 28th in the league in rushing yards, and when you're a team that spent recent second-round picks on Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet, that's not good. And it's kind of stupid in and of itself to invest 2 second-round picks and basically back-to-back years on running backs. And then when you do, you're in the bottom 5 of the league in rushing yards. Like, just really, really dumb use of draft pick allocation and just poor performance from the running backs and the offensive line and etc. Meanwhile, their defense certainly saw some improvements, which you would hope they would under a new head coach, in particular a new defensive-minded head coach. They went from 30th in yards allowed in 2023 to 14th this past season. They went from 25th in points allowed to 11th this season. Here's what I'll call out, though. They had some moments where they really shit the bed. Like weeks 4 through 6, when they had that 3-game losing streak, it was really bad. And in particular, they let the Giants look good. What the fuck are you doing? And then again in weeks 8 and 9, they kind of crapped the bed. So, yes, overall, much better defense compared to the previous season. But at key moments, they weren't great when they probably needed to be just adequate, and they couldn't even be that. And what's crazy to me now is you look at this Seahawks team, somehow they're about $11 million over the salary cap. That's just insane to me. You're not a championship contending team. How do you end up over the salary cap? It's just nuts. Now you can sit there and say they could save $17 million by cutting Tyler Lockett. He feels like he's close to the end. Maybe they'll restructure and do something else, but they could just cut him and save a crap ton of money. And maybe with the progression of Jackson Smith-Njigba to be your top receiving option in 2024, it makes it easier to cut a Tyler Lockett and go find a replacement in the draft. They could save $11 million by cutting Draymond Jones. I'm not sure if they're ready to do that, but it wouldn't kill him if they did because he hasn't been all that productive there. They could save $9 million by releasing Noah Fant, which you could say, well, if he's their tight end one, do you really want to do that? That's a fair point. You could restructure, could do something else, or you could say, no, fuck it. Like, too much money for too little production. Let's go fix this in the draft or via a different option. They could save $6.5 million or so by cutting Roy Robertson Harris. So good news for the Seahawks. Bad news is they're over the salary cap. Good news is they can make a few moves here. Like if they cut everybody I just called out, how much would you really notice? Like, let's be honest here. Cutting Tyler Lockett at this stage of his career, Draymond Jones, Noah Fant, Roy Robertson Harris. If they cut all 4 of those guys, that would be over $40 million in cap savings realized. So you go from about $11 million over the salary cap to about $30 million under the salary cap. Gives you a little bit of flexibility. Like, possible, right? And feels digestible if that's what they decided to do. We'll see how it all plays out. But going into this offseason, I think the biggest thing they need to do is they need to address that offensive line. It feels like it's been a problem for them for a long time. Charles Cross is a stud. So they got one tackle position locked down. And Oluwatimi, I guess you could say, like, give him another year as a starter and see if he grows and develops. Don't feel like a huge urgency to have to replace him. But the other 3 offensive line slots, starting with right tackle, they are in bad need of upgrading. And, I would fully expect right tackle or one of the guard positions to be a major consideration for the Seahawks at round 1. Pick 18 feels like a perfect place to address one of those spots. The only other thing I could see them addressing at pick 18 might be edge rusher. They could certainly use another one, and this is a really, really good draft for them. But I gotta say, like, if you had your druthers, if the edge rusher wins out, it means that the defensive-minded head coach might have too much influence in the room. The biggest issue for this team overall is the offensive line. It's hard to envision that they have options in place to fill the void at some of these positions, because if they did, they would already be playing and filling the void. And they don't have the cap space, even if they cut some of the guys that I mentioned, to go out there and be aggressive spenders in free agency to address the offensive line in the ways that are required. So you've got to do that via the draft. And this needs to be a draft that heavily emphasizes the trenches with a bias towards the offensive line. Because you look at it, you got to protect Geno Smith, so that way he can fully utilize weapons like Jackson Smith-Njigba and DK Metcalf. You've also got to do it because you have multiple former second-round picks invested in the running back position, so a way to get maximum value out of that is an offensive line that can block in front of them, which they don't fucking have right now. You can talk about other positions. Wide receiver might be in need if you do release Tyler Lockett, and I think even if you reworked and restructured him and kept him, it's still a need long term, right? But something you could address in the middle rounds of the draft. But this draft has to be about the trenches. I'd expect him to address edge rusher at some point, but they've got to get a right tackle and they've got to get starters at both of their guard spots. If they don't do that, it's going to be another rough year on the ground for the Seahawks.